Hello everybody! Today I'm going to show you how I turned this big thrifted shirt into a wrap dress. That's today on Refashioning with Rachel. First, with the shirt tried on, I made a mark where I wanted my waist to be. Then I unpicked the front pocket and used a tweezer to pick up any threads left behind. I cut off the cuffs and set them aside for later. And I also cut off the collar. I drew a straight line across the waist where I put that mark earlier, and cut off the bottom of the shirt and set it aside for later. For this dress, I decided to make a pattern so that I could reuse it for many other sewing projects. I folded my pattern paper in half and used a shirt that fit me well to trace for my pattern. I marked my waistline on the shirt and folded it in half and pinned it in place. I lined up the fold in the shirt with the fold in the pattern paper and traced around the seams of the shirt. I folded the sleeve out of the way so that I could see exactly where the seams were and transfer them onto the pattern paper. For the neck hole, I just traced the back of the neck because I can always enlarge the neck hole in the front. I made a line perpendicular to the fold at the waistline. And since the shirt was a little bit loose on me, I decided to take it in 1 inch at the waist. I cut out this pattern piece and I made a note on it that no seams are allowed, which does not mean that it's forbidden to have seams. It just means I need to remember to add seams when I'm cutting out my fabric. I lined up my shirt sleeve with the straight edge of the pattern paper and traced around it. I did not include a cuff in this pattern piece so that I could have the option of adding it later if I wanted to or not. I drew some arrows on this pattern piece to indicate where I should line it up with the fold in the fabric. I used the sleeve pattern to trace out and cut out my sleeve from the sleeve of my thrifted shirt, making sure to add 1 centimeter for seam allowance. And cut out a second sleeve on the other side. And I made a couple of marks to indicate the center of the sleeves. The back of the bodice had a pleat that I wanted to get rid of, so I pinned it down along the folds and made a stitch close to the edge of the fold. Using the pattern piece that I drafted earlier, I lined up the shoulder seams with the shoulder seams on the shirt and traced around the pattern piece, adding a centimeter for seam allowance. And I cut that out. And cut off the button placket from the front. And I also removed these unnecessary buttons. Now, in order to make this a wrap dress, I needed to add some fabric to the center front. So I used these pieces of scrap fabric that were left over from when I cut out the sleeves. I pinned and sewed them to both sides of the center front. And ironed them so they would lie flat. And extended a straight line from the waist and drew a straight line from the neck to the bottom of the center front. And I cut along those lines. Before I went any further, I stay stitched the neck hole and the opening so that it wouldn't shift around as I continued this project. I just made a straight stitch all around the opening close to the edge, making sure not to stretch the fabric as I sewed. I marked the center of the shoulders, and with right sides together, I pinned the center of the sleeve to the center of the armhole. Then, starting at each end of the armhole and working my way back up to the center, I pinned each sleeve to the armholes. I also made sure that the button in the sleeve was facing toward the back. And then I sewed the sleeves to the armholes. With the sleeves attached, I folded the front of the bodice onto the back of the bodice with right sides together and pinned along the side seams and the underarm seams. Then I sewed the side seams and the underarm seams all in one go. I used a serger to finish off my raw edges, but a zigzag stitch would have also worked very well. At this point, I tried on the bodice and decided I needed to add a few darts. I just pinched in the fabric in a few places and held it in place with a few pins until I decided I liked where the darts were, and then drew in some more exact lines and sewed in the darts. I added a couple of darts in the back as well. And finally, I made sure to iron out the points in the darts. Moving on to the bottom of the dress, I cut off the button placket and made a basting stitch all along the top of the skirt. I marked the center of the skirt to help me line everything up and gathered up the fabric until it was the same width as the bodice. Then, with right sides facing, I pinned the skirt to the bodice, lining up the centers and pinning at the sides. And I sewed them together. Evening out the gathers as I sewed. When the skirt was attached, I pulled out the basting stitch. To finish off the neck hole, I needed a bit of scrap fabric, so I ripped out a long strip of 1 inch wide scrap fabric and ironed it flat, and then ironed it in half. I pinned it to the right side of the dress all along the neck hole, lining up all of the raw edges. And I sewed it down using a very small seam allowance. As I'm sewing, I'm lining up the fold of the strip along with the presser foot of my sewing machine. Then I trimmed away about half of the seam allowance, leaving just about 1 millimeter or 2. Then, flipping over to the wrong side of the fabric, I folded over the strip and sewed it down close to the fold in the strip. And now the neck hole is nicely finished. And I ironed it to make it lie smoothly. I finished the opening of the skirt simply by folding over the raw edge twice and securing with a stitch. I made a buttonhole on one side of the dress near the waist. I like to make my buttonholes just with a short zigzag stitch and just going around in a box. And carefully cut it open using a seam ripper. Using all of my scraps of fabric, I cut out as many 1-inch wide strips as I could. I needed enough fabric to make 2 ties, one tie about as long as my waist, and another tie about as long as my waist and a half. I sewed all of these strips together at the ends. And ironed the seams flat and folded the strips in half and made a stitch about 3/8 of an inch away from the fold. I used some thread and an embroidery needle to turn these strips right side out. And then neatened them up with an iron. I attached the shorter of the 2 ties to the side of the dress that had the buttonhole, and the longer tie to the other side. The cuffs that I removed earlier were already a good width for my wrists, so I just cut them back to about 2 inches and pinned them to the ends of the sleeves, matching up all of the ends. And folding up this excess fabric in the sleeve into a little pleat to make it fit the cuff. On this sleeve, you could see it a little better that there was a little bit of extra fabric in the sleeve, but I just folded it into a little pleat and then it fit. Then I sewed the cuffs to the sleeves. And finished off the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. So now it looks much nicer. And then I opened up the seam and top stitched the seam allowance away from the cuff and to the end of the sleeve. And then this project was finished. So here's a reminder of how this shirt looked before. And here is how it looks now. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you did, and check out some of my other refashioning videos. And have a beautiful day.